Welcome to Harrowing Tales, where the most chilling stories await you. Tonight, I'll guide you through a tale that might just linger in your mind long after the lights go out. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share where you're watching from and the time. It's always darkest before dawn, isn't it? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's step into the shadows together. It was the kind of night that seemed to swallow every ounce of light. Rain poured from the sky in torrents, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away the sins of the earth. The wind howled through the trees, and thunder cracked in the distance, echoing like a warning to those who dared venture outside. Ella and Michael had just arrived at the house. Their house, the one they had inherited from a distant relative. The house stood isolated, its stone walls covered in ivy, with windows that glowed faintly in the dark, as though they had a life of their own. The kind of life that whispered secrets to anyone who would listen. As they stood at the front door, the air felt thick with tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Michael was the first to break the silence. "We're finally here, Ella," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "This is it." Ella forced a smile, but there was an unease deep within her. She had never seen the house before, but something about it made her skin crawl. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it. The pull of something dark and ancient that seemed to reach out from the very walls. "Let's make the best of it," Ella said, pushing the door open. The door groaned as it swung inward, as though reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The house was cold, far colder than the autumn air outside. Michael flicked the light switch, but the bulbs buzzed and flickered before finally casting a dim, yellow glow. They stepped into the entryway, which was adorned with faded portraits of long-dead relatives. The air smelled musty, as though the house hadn't been touched in years. "Are you sure about this?" Ella asked, her voice soft, almost to herself. Michael didn't answer immediately. He was already walking ahead, examining the old staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. The stairs creaked under his weight, each step an unwelcome groan of protest. Ella shivered and closed the door behind them. She glanced around, her eyes landing on a small hallway that led deeper into the house. It looked as though it hadn't been used in a long time. There were no signs of recent life, no dusting, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had lived there for years. "There's something wrong here," Ella muttered to herself, her eyes narrowing as she stared into the dark hallway. But Michael was already upstairs, unaware of the unease gnawing at her insides. The first night in the house was like a dream, and not the kind anyone wanted to have. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching them. The shadows moved with a life of their own, and the wind that howled outside seemed to carry with it whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, but everywhere at once. It wasn't until they sat down for dinner that Ella truly began to notice the oddities. They had settled in the living room, a crackling fire keeping the cold at bay, the faintest echo of rain tapping against the windows. "So," Michael began, placing his fork down and looking around, "what do you think?" "It's quiet," Ella replied, glancing around the room. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows. "Too quiet." Michael chuckled, a nervous laugh. "We're just getting used to it, that's all." But Ella's unease only deepened. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too quiet, almost as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, as they lay in bed, the house began to reveal its first secret. At first, it was subtle, just a low creak from somewhere deep within the house. Then a thud, followed by a dragging sound that echoed down the hallway. Ella's heart raced. She clutched the covers tighter around her body. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely daring to speak. Michael, who had been lying with his back turned, was now sitting up, his eyes wide in the dark. "I heard it," he said, his voice strained. "It's probably just the house settling." But Ella wasn't so sure. The noise sounded deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving through the house. Another creak, this time louder. It came from the attic. "Michael," Ella began, but her voice caught in her throat. The dragging sound started again, this time closer. It moved toward the bedroom door, slow and steady. They both stared at the door, breath caught in their throats, as the shadows seemed to stretch toward them, curling and twisting in unnatural ways. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. The door slammed open, sending a blast of cold air into the room. Ella gasped, and Michael jumped from the bed, reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. His hand shook as he turned it on, casting a shaky beam of light across the room. But there was nothing there. Just the empty, silent hallway. "See," Michael said, exhaling sharply. "It's just the wind, or maybe—" But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something that was waiting. The next morning, Ella awoke with a sense of dread hanging heavy in the air. The night had felt like an eternity, each creak and groan of the house replaying in her mind over and over. Michael, however, seemed unaffected by the strange events. He had fallen into a deep, almost unnatural sleep after the incident in the bedroom, as if the night had never happened. But Ella couldn't forget. The sound, the dragging noise, the cold blast of air, it had felt real. Too real. She had tried to push the thoughts aside, thinking it was just the house settling, but a small part of her wondered if there was more to it. As she made her way downstairs, she passed by the living room and glanced out the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray, as though the storm was still lingering somewhere far off, waiting. The wind was gone, but the unsettling silence remained. Michael was in the kitchen, his back turned as he rummaged through cabinets. "You okay?" he asked, his voice distant but calm. Ella hesitated before answering. "I don't know, Michael. Something's not right. I keep hearing things. The noises from last night, the whispers. I don't think it was the wind." Michael turned around, looking at her with a mixture of concern and amusement. "Ella, you've been reading too many ghost stories. This house is old, and yeah, it makes strange noises, but it's just that, a house. I'm sure it's nothing." Ella nodded, but a chill ran down her spine. She didn't know how to explain it, but she knew deep down that there was something more, something lurking in the shadows of this house. That afternoon, Ella decided to explore the house on her own. Michael had gone into town to get some supplies, leaving her alone with a growing unease she couldn't shake. The house felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, less threatening, but still, there was something off about it. The walls seemed to close in on her as she wandered through the rooms. Every time she passed a mirror, she caught a fleeting glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. She made her way up to the attic. It had been locked the night before, but she had found the key hidden in an old drawer in the hallway. Now, with the door creaking open, she felt the temperature drop once again, the chill running up her spine. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small window, barely letting in any daylight. Ella stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floor. Dust danced in the air, swirling around her as she took in the sight before her. Old furniture covered in sheets, cardboard boxes filled with forgotten memories, and the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her eyes were drawn to a small desk in the corner, where an old leather-bound book sat open. It looked like it had been recently used, and as Ella approached it, she saw the pages filled with strange, spidery writing. "The Watchers." Ella shivered as she traced the words with her fingers. She flipped through the pages, the writing growing darker and more frantic with each one. The Watchers were a presence, an ancient force tied to the house. It was said they watched those who lived there, feeding off their fear and their emotions, growing stronger with each passing day. A sudden noise behind her made her freeze. A faint rustling, like someone, or something, was moving just out of sight. She turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. The attic was empty, silent, except for the soft whisper of the wind outside. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the desk, her eyes scanning the room. There was no denying it now. The house was alive, and it was watching her. The days that followed only grew stranger. Ella's unease deepened with each passing hour, and Michael seemed more and more distant. He was tired, exhausted, in fact, and he grew increasingly irritable. He'd snap at her over the smallest things, his temper flaring for no apparent reason. Ella tried to talk to him about the things she had experienced, but he brushed her off, telling her it was all in her head. But even he couldn't explain the odd occurrences that had started happening more frequently. Every night, the whispers grew louder. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move on their own, shifting as if they were alive. Ella could feel the cold, clammy fingers of fear creeping up her spine every time the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. One evening, after Michael had gone to bed early, Ella sat in the living room alone. She had tried to relax, to tell herself that it was all just her imagination, but the house wouldn't let her. Then, it came again. The tapping. At first, it was faint, like something, or someone, was knocking at the door. But then the sound grew louder. It was coming from inside the house, somewhere deep within. The hallway. The attic. And then, it stopped. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She stood up, her legs trembling as she moved toward the sound. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. When she reached the attic door, it was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling through the crack. Ella hesitated. Her pulse was racing, her every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But something deep inside, told her she had to go in. She slowly pushed the door open. Ella hesitated for a long moment, the attic door trembling in her hand. It was as though the house itself was holding her there, its weight pressing down on her chest. She swallowed hard, but the air felt thick with something wrong. The floor creaked under her feet as she slowly pushed the door open, inch by inch, allowing the darkness to spill out like something alive, waiting for her to step into it. The attic was cold, far colder than any other room in the house. The shadows twisted and shifted, reaching for her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The only sound in the attic was the rhythmic drumming of her own heartbeat. She barely dared to breathe as she stepped inside, her feet barely making a sound on the dusty floor. The air smelled of age, dust, old wood, and something else. Something faint, something metallic. Ella's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the strange objects scattered about. Old furniture draped in tattered sheets, cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs that clung to every corner. But it was the farthest corner of the room that caught her attention. There, in the corner, sat a chair. A single old wooden chair that seemed out of place, its back facing her. The floor around it was disturbed, as though someone, or something, had been pacing back and forth. A soft scraping sound echoed through the room, coming from behind the chair. Ella's blood ran cold. She had felt the presence behind her long before she heard the noise. Slowly, she turned her head. There, standing in the shadow, was a figure, a silhouette against the darkened corner. A figure with glowing eyes, watching her. A pair of eyes that seemed to gleam with malice and hunger. Ella's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate. The whispers from the house grew louder, swirling around her, the voices growing frantic, urging her to leave. But her feet were frozen to the floor, her body unwilling to move. The figure stepped closer, its eyes now fully visible. They weren't human. No, they were something else, something unnatural. The thing that stood before her wasn't alive in the way she understood. It was as though it was born from the shadows, an ancient presence that had existed long before the house had even been built. Who are you? Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a rasp, it spoke. "We are the Watchers," it hissed. "We watch, and we wait." Ella stumbled backward, her heart racing. She had heard the name before, in the diary she had found. The Watchers. But this was no longer a story. This was real. It moved closer again, and Ella could feel an icy chill seep into her bones, wrapping around her like a deathly embrace. The air grew heavy, thick with the presence of something ancient and cruel. "Why are you here?" Ella managed to gasp. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised one long, bony finger, pointing directly at her. A soft, eerie chuckle escaped from its lips. "We want to feed," it rasped. "We feed on fear. We feed on the lost. And you are ours now." The words echoed in Ella's mind as the air grew thick, suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for her. The walls of the attic seemed to close in, pressing tighter and tighter until it felt as though the entire house was closing around her, its dark heart beating louder and louder. Suddenly, Ella snapped back to reality, her body jerking violently. She stumbled backwards, her legs giving out beneath her as she collapsed to the ground. Her breath came in sharp, frantic gasps, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But then, the whispers started again, louder this time, more urgent. They were coming from everywhere, swirling around her, like thousands of voices speaking in unison. The attic was alive with the sound of it. The watchers were all around her. She tried to stand, but the shadows tugged at her, pulling her back. Her hands shot out, grabbing at the walls, at the floor, anything to stop herself from being consumed by the darkness. But the more she struggled, the stronger the pull became. In that moment, she realized what she had to do. The house had been feeding off them, off their fear, their isolation, their emotions. But now, Ella understood what the watchers truly were. They were not just spirits. They were the house itself. And the house had been waiting for them, for someone to come, to feed off, to trap within its walls. She didn't have much time. She could feel the presence closing in on her, the cold fingers of fear tightening around her chest. But she wasn't going to let the house claim her. Not without a fight. Her mind raced as she scrambled toward the attic door, but it wouldn't open. She yanked at the handle, but it was as though the door had been sealed shut, locked by some unseen force. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the watchers drew nearer, their eyes glowing in the dark. Ella knew she had no choice but to confront them, to break free of the fear that had kept her captive all this time. She closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the old leather-bound book she had found earlier. The pages were filled with the watchers' names, souls who had been consumed, trapped in the house for eternity. With trembling hands, Ella flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the cryptic entries. And then, she found it. A passage. A way to banish the watchers. She whispered the words aloud, her voice shaky but determined. The house groaned in protest, as though it were alive and angry. The shadows screamed as they began to retreat, fading into nothingness. The attic door flew open with a loud crash, and Ella stumbled out into the hallway. She didn't look back as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the house groaning and creaking, as if it were alive, as if it were trying to hold her back. But she was free. Ella never saw Michael again. When the authorities arrived, all they found was the house, abandoned and eerily silent. The doors were locked, the windows boarded up, as though no one had lived there for years. But Ella knew the truth. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. She never spoke of the events again, but the nightmares continued. Every night, the whispers would return. And every night, Ella would hear the same words. "We are the Watchers, and you are ours."